Hello there, I'm Tony Harris.
And I'm Paul Howarth,
Welcome to the Twilight Turntable,
where we encourage you to revive the lost art of listening.
one late night long player at a time.
Hello, Paul.
Hello there, Tone. How the devil are you?
I'm very good, thank you. What fettle yourself?
Very well, thank you. Lovely to see you again. Lovely to be here once more, gathered around the Twilight Turntable.
Oh, you're very kind. Now, I will very briefly, just for the few people who've decided to tune in, explain what we do here. For those of you who are listening regularly, you'll have twigged on, but for the rest of you, this is new. And as some of you know, I like to spend my last act before going to bed. Don't worry, stay calm, nothing untoward's about to happen. My last act before I go to bed is inevitably to sit down and listen to a long playing record. I don't do anything else. I don't read a book. I don't watch TV. I don't look at my phone. I just sit there and listen. And that's why we talk about wanting to revive the lost art of listening, because many of us just use it as background to other things that we do. And it truly is one of the most pleasurable experiences you can have. So in wanting to convert more of the nations of the world to this practice, I, with my most willing partner here,
Hello.
Thank you, Paul, I set him homework every week or for every episode of listening to an album that I think he might be interested in, but has probably had very little exposure to. And then we chat about it and chat about its effect and how it came about and whether basically he enjoyed it or not. And I have to say, this week, I think I set you something that I've always tried to give you something that I thought you'd always, I kind of felt you'd gravitate more easily towards. This one I thought might be a little bit chewier for you. So perhaps you'd like to, I will hold up the album and perhaps you'd like to introduce it to the listeners.
Well, and it is a thing of beauty, if we can get a visual reference to it. The Ultravox album, Rage in Eden, with an incredible piece of artwork on the front by Peter
Saville, who also did many of New Order and Joy Division and OMD. He did a lot of their covers. And the interesting with this one, he lifted it directly from a French artist called Henri Morvin, who actually had been quite famous for doing advertising posters in the 50s in France. And it was a direct lift. And his family, because I think he'd only very recently died, took exception. So only the very first pressings had that cover.
Yes.
Until many, many years later when the licensing was worked out. So you might find, if you're shopping around, you may find that there are covers of this that don't look like the original. But the original, I mean, it's a stunning cover.
Yes.
And Peter Saville is one of the best cover artists you can find.
No doubt. So I was aware, I'd read about this problem with the licensing on later releases. I hadn't realized it was because he'd lifted it from Morvin. But
if you look at the original, you'll see it's, I mean, shameless, shameless appropriation,
shameless magpieing. We don't mind a bit of that. So yes, this is Ultravox's fifth studio album, although I think only the second one featuring Midge as lead vocalist. Is that correct?
Yep. This is Ultravox Mark II.
Yeah, and this is coming on the back of Vienna. So earlier this year they've had, I think the album was called Vienna, and of course the very famous single Vienna, one of the highest selling singles of that year, one of the highest selling singles never to get to number one, all that stuff. So they're coming off the back of that. Important context, I think. And listen, I quite enjoyed this album. I quite enjoyed it. One of the first things I noticed when I listened through first was that it had this incredible. So I knew that they were heavily influenced by synth. I mean, three of the band are listed as synth players on this album, so you kind of know what's going to happen. And I thought it was going to be sort of 100% that, but actually, there's quite a lot of heavy-ish and rocky guitar almost throughout. So if you look at tracks like We Stand Alone, or Accent on Youth, or Thin Wall at the end of that track, or a track called Stranger Within. Stranger Within's quite an interesting one, I thought, because the guitar, when you listen to an album for the first time and you just hear something and you think, oh God, inevitably that reminds me of something or other. And I couldn't quite place it, but I think that sort of really insistent guitar piece in that really reminds me of some early U2 on tracks like I Will Follow or Gloria, if you remember those tracks. It's very edgy, literally edgy.
And he will undoubtedly have been listening to that. This is, and one of the things I know is true of this album is that the bass lines were listened to very closely by Adam Clayton. Okay. And The Stranger Within is interesting, actually, because it really is. I mean, it's a relentless sort of synth loop and sequenced beat that goes right the way through. And yet somehow, for nearly 8 minutes, it manages to stay really quite interesting. They managed to find new instrumental ways of sort of keeping it lively and quite vigorous. It's obviously quite menacing, but it's sort of, there's things that sort of pulse through it that sort of keep it quite lively. Yeah.
And I think quite a lot of this album is a bit menacing. I mean, I read something that Mid-Year said about this. Oh, by the way, whenever I do one of these, Tony, I learn something that I think, how on earth have I never known this until now? So on this occasion,
what his name is?
Yeah, Midge is Jim backwards.
Yeah,
because of one of his previous bands, there was another Jim in it, and he said, "I'm going to call you Midge from now on." Then, so we can distinguish between the two. So until the other day, no idea. Midge is Jim backwards. James is obviously his real name. Anyway, I was reading one of the things that he said about it. He said it's one of his favorite albums that he's made, and he talks about there being this starkness. He said this austere, mystical distance, a coldness, but a coldness that sort of works. And it is, all of that is absolutely true. I thought it was a great encapsulation of what this album is and the character of this album.
It's very, very austere, isn't it? I mean, it's a very Central European art house deliberately. I mean, it feels like a movie soundtrack in many ways, not necessarily to a film you necessarily want to watch, but it has that sort of there's an ominous sort of feeling to the whole thing. And I think it and there is a sort of sense, and in the lyrics it's there, and we'll come on and talk a little bit about the lyrics later, but there is a sort of sense of isolation and outlierness, not fitting in it, and it's sort of interesting because this was a record that they went over to Germany and lived in the studio of a very famous German producer called Conny Plank.
Yep.
And
Great
this
name.
is in a place called Wulparach.
Yes.
Excuse my German. It's not my native tongue. It's near Cologne anyway. It's about an hour from Cologne or something like that. And they go there for 3 months, and there is nothing around apart from it's a farmhouse, and there's just nothing there.
Since we're talking about the studio, I should probably introduce at this point the Twilight tidbit for this episode.
Tidbit away.
Yes, allow me to tidbit, and once I've tidbitted, we can carry on. I was fascinated to learn that the band had not written anything, no material at all, until they arrived at Conny Plank's studio. And in fact, Warren Cann, the percussionist in the band, said they almost wanted to use the studio as an instrument, which I thought was an interesting idea as well. So anyway, that's the tidbit this week. So between now and the end of the episode, Tony, if you can think of other examples of where bands have no material to hand until they arrive, bands or other performing artists who haven't written anything until they get to the studio. And actually, when I was doing a little research around this, it might be more common than I had thought, but it did strike me as a bit odd, not least from a cost point of view.
Well, yeah, it's expensive business. I assume it's all written into their latest contract.
Sorry, tell us a bit more about Connie then. He died very young, didn't he?
Comparatively young. I mean, he'd been a producer for sort of very experimental German bands like Can and Kraftwerk.
Yeah.
And the influence of that is very clear and has been on Ultravox since their since they started, even in their first phase. And certainly Bowie's Berlin trilogy and Roxy have all kind of used this, and that sort of fed into being influenced on them. So they used him for this. It was the second album they actually I think it was the third album they'd used him for, but then the second with in phase 2. And I think it clearly lends itself to the tone and atmosphere that's set up throughout this, because it's different to Vienna in that it's deeper. It's got I think that point you made about Warren Cann in the studio, it has a really expressive and sometimes really packed soundstage with a lot going on. And then other moments, it's like huge expanses of silence, and I think that's, I think it's quite interesting that, and we'll come on and talk about some of the tricks they play as they record it. But it definitely is an album that feels like a whole. It's difficult just to pick out a bit and a piece of it, because actually it is a pretty complete piece of work.
No, indeed. And actually, when you get to the last 3 tracks on the album, so that's Accent on Youth, then this kind of bridgy shorter track called The Ascent, which I liked, and it actually sounds a bit film tracky as well. You mentioned this before.
Yeah, it does.
And then as that goes into the final track, Your Name Has Slipped My Mind Again. And all 3 of those tracks on the album are stitched together. They feel like one. And I wondered why they didn't sort of go the whole hog and stitch the whole thing together in that way, because you're right, it does feel like a single piece.
I suspect, I think there is another little sort of suite in there, which I think is Rage in Eden and I Remember Death in the Afternoon. And actually, this is where we can talk about the recording thing, because Rage in Eden is actually, they've just reversed the chords of I Remember Death in the Afternoon. They call it backmasking.
Well, they took the whole the whole of the chorus of Death in the Afternoon became the chorus backwards
in Rage.
Yeah.
And I think that therefore gives it a sort of a symmetry as well, which you may not. It's only when you read it you go, kind of, that's why they sort of feel like they do feel like a pair.
Yes.
And it's and I find that quite interesting. And I don't know why they didn't knit it together. I mean, we've talked in the past about Face to Face when we did the Kings, and they were trying to. I think they just probably never felt it was necessary, but they liked it at the end piece because you have the Ascent, which is that super sort of instrumental interlude, which is one of Billy Curry's finest moments, and he has a lot of fine moments in his career, but that really is. And then it's that final piano descent opens up to this huge incessant drum that leads you into Your Name Has Slipped My Mind Again. I find that a very powerful transition.
I agree, actually, and so the Ascent is probably one of the, even though it's the shortest track by far on the album, is one that is quite an important track, if you like, in the context of the album. It does remind me of a film soundtrack.
Yeah.
Perhaps, I mean, I don't think either of us would be rushing out to go and see the director's cut of Blade Runner.
No.
You know, but this is the sort of soundtrack you might expect in that sort of context. That real stark, futuristic, with a great distance as well. The music has a great distance.
Actually, there is a remix of it that's just been come out for the anniversary, which sadly, two of the master tapes, two of the songs have been lost, so they weren't able to.
Oh God!
To do any work on those. But you listen to it, and they've just changed the balance slightly, particularly the bass, and opened up some of the sound, and it is an incredible experience. It's really good.
Can we talk a bit about Midge's vocal?
I mean, he has the most powerful baritone. And I think it's really, particularly if you hear old Ultravox, because John Fox was their old singer. He had quite a distinctive voice, but it always felt a little bit a bit distant and a bit reedy and a little undisciplined.
Yeah.
I mean, Midge's sounds like it's, straight out of the opera house.
Well, yes. I'm fascinated that you should say that, because what I found in a number of these songs, when you get to them, is that often his entry into the song vocally, you feel like you've joined him midway and he's already at crescendo.
It's quite a melodramatic vocal he's got, and the lyrics he writes make it even more so.
So you think about The Thin Wall, for example, or Accent on Youth, or Stranger Within, or I Remember Death in the Afternoon. He sort of comes in and you're like, Jesus, Midge, are you all right? It's because like almost like a childlike urgency.
I mean, the interesting thing with him is that he'd been in 4 chart bands already.
Yeah.
He's pretty experienced at what he does. And I think he just is able to give full vent to the fact that he is really a very, very strong vocalist. It's not. I can imagine it's not everybody's style, but wow, there's some power in there.
Yeah, and I like the operatic reference. I'm all for a bit of melodrama in pop music, and some of my favorite stuff falls into that camp. I mean, camp's quite a good word to use as well. It can lean into high camp, uber melodrama. Music like this will have gone on to inspire much more poppy acts, which probably a bit more up my street. So I'm a big Erasure fan, as I'm sure you know from years gone by. They've even got a song called Drama, haven't they? So that kind of area. So I'm not averse to it. It didn't always sit that well with me, with Midge, for some reason. I find his
it's darker. It isn't camp, actually. I think it's much more Don Giovanni than the Barber of Seville. And of course, the songs that he's singing, there's nothing light here. They're all "We Stand Alone."
Yeah.
The voice, which is a sort of huge attack on the media of the day.
Yeah.
"We Stand Alone," which is almost. I can never quite work out if he's saying he's for or against the new romantic movement that he's found himself in.
Yeah.
You've got The Thin Wall, which is absolutely about. They move with bovine grace and move in syncopation. I'm sure he was looking out at cows at the time, out of the studio window, and thought, "Oh, bovine grace, I'll do."
Just living lines from books we've read, with atmospheres of days gone by, with paper smiles, a screenplay calls, a message for the nation. And those who see will fade and die, and those who love will surely fall, and those who know will always feel the back to get to
But I found it, he has this sort of incredible power. I mean, that comes from there. And I think because of the way that the songs are written,
Mm.
there's no jollity in it. It is as cold and as stark as they wanted it to be.
There is no jollity in it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't provoke the odd smile. So that line about shuffling with a bovine grace and glide in syncopation made me titter a bit, as did in We Stand Alone, this gigolo and gigolette. I mean, talking about taking the piss out of opera, really. You know what I mean? But in a way,
I think he's taking a piss out of the New Romantic.
You may well be right. He may have been looking around the Blitz kids on a Tuesday night. While we're on that track, by the way, We Stand Alone, there's a lovely little, probably no more than half a second piece of audio at the start of it. I can't even do it. It's one of those electronic chung, and it just reminded me. And then I thought, do you know what? That's exactly the same as the noise you hear at the start of Party Fears 2 by the Associates.
Which is
round about exactly, like a couple of months afterwards. And I think they actually wrote that song originally in '79, the Associates.
Yeah.
It's a noise, but it just totally reminded me of it.
I think it's a fader. They use a lot of that faders, flanges. They use a lot of those. We Stand Alone, I think, is an interesting. So I think that's the third. That would have been the third single.
Yeah,
I mean, it feels like it. I'm sort of surprised it wasn't. But the two singles on here,
yes,
The Thin Wall and The Voice. I mean, they really do dominate the whole proceedings because they're immense kind of records.
And conventionally in many ways they're the first song on respective sides of the album. That's quite a conventional way of doing it, right? And also, I looked this up, they were both performed on Top of the Pops. So I normally say with these albums I've not heard any of it apart from usually the single. I'd never knowingly heard these songs, but I must have done because I was 9 years old. I would have watched Top of the Pops 7:30 on a Thursday. I must have seen, and I probably have heard them on the radio and or when they were on Top of the Pops.
Well, it's interesting. I was a big fan of Ultravox. I went out. They used to all their singles in the mid-year phase were issued on clear vinyl 7-inch singles.
Oh, were they? Right
the way through from 80 through to 86 were the last singles, and I had a full collection of all of them.
Wow,
I loved them. But there were people like me who loved them, but I didn't know anybody else who liked them. I didn't know anybody else who liked Ultravox. They were nobody's favorite band. And I think they just became, there was clearly a gear change that happened. They had been on the Blitz Club playlist. So the old stuff like, Hiroshima Mon Amour and All Stood Still off Vienna were real Blitz Club staples. But then, it's interesting. I was reading I went to look back at Dave Rimmer's book, The Look Romantics. There's no mention of Ultravox in it at all, apart from when he talks about a famous sort of almost like a final party for the New Romantic scene.
Yeah.
And Ultravox are playing.
Yeah.
And he refers to them as they're playing the monumentally dull Vienna at the beginning of 81.
Yeah.
And that's the only mention they get. And I think the truth is, I don't think they were really a New Romantic album. I think the problem they had is that they were what was called, and there was a chart, I think it was in the NME, that used to be called the Futurist chart.
Okay.
And it was sort of alternative but electronic music.
Yeah.
So that will have morphed into indie eventually, but it was Joy Division, Cabaret Voltaire, OMD, The Fall. And Ultravox, certainly in phase one, were in it.
Yeah.
By phase two, they're probably not. But I think one of the reasons is that I think they stuck true to that whole futurist mentality of we really like Bowie's Berlin trilogy. We think long and hard about Kraftwerk. We have a whole mood and feel, which is this sort of Central European art house, and we're not going to deviate from it. Whereas I think some of the other bands kind of decided to write more pop records and took on less and were less true to their original vision. And I think as a result, Ultravox probably lost fans along the way because it wasn't, you didn't always want to hear something like The Thin Wall. You know, the next ones are Him and Reap the Wild Wind are their next singles. And they're just these huge, immense sort of landscape records.
Yeah.
I think people kind of moved away.
Maybe I'm one of those slightly shallow people then, Tone, because I think I prefer some of the stuff that came after it that was inspired by it, that perhaps was a bit more accessible or a bit more poppy. So I've mentioned Erasure, obviously Pet Shop Boys and things like that as well.
Yeah.
Because and what I've loved particularly about the albums we've reviewed these past few episodes is, you know, I like a bit of darkness and a bit of sadness and stuff that really tugs at the heartstrings. And although I know he's writing here about a lot of emotional subjects, it never quite got me there, apart from perhaps the final track, which has got a great title, by the way. Your Name Has Slipped My Mind Again. I mean, there's a story in those, what is it, 6 or 7 words.
Your name has slipped my mind again.
And you mentioned that this is a very different record from Vienna, although this has still clearly got echoes of it with that sort of echoey drum.
It's quite impenetrable. I mean, you're not.
Yes.
You know, that thing about coldness and austerity. I mean, it's there. I mean, it's not putting a hand around your shoulder. This record.
But deliberately. You said it's a deliberate commitment to all those things. The Central European stuff, the kind of German music influence, deliberate sort of distance, if you like. And so the fact that doesn't make me feel emotion in the way that a lot of my favorite songs that we've looked at over the past few weeks it's not their fault. And also kind of lyrically, we've mentioned a couple of their lyrics. If you take a track like Rage in Eden, the title track here, and look at some of the lyrics, there's I'll read you one of the verses. Disciples of the new way, portraits in the sand, see when they run their longest mile, holding caps in wet hand, eyes upon them try to focus on the main facade. Like, I love that as a piece of poetry. I can imagine doing that in A-level English or something and trying to deconstruct it. I love it, kind of the meter of it and all of that stuff, but it doesn't make me feel particularly.
Well, they use the same lyrical trick that Bowie did. It's very Bowie-esque, this, which is literally, he would chop up words and put them together to see what. Heaven 17, who are also around us, also used to do that. You know, they sort of slightly slavishly followed Bowie and kind of wanted to sort of come up with new kind of word puzzles, you know, in the lyrics. And they are. You kind of go, wow, that's so deep. And yet you go, I have no idea if it's deep or not. They know what it means. Yeah. And I like it for the fact that you can kind of project whatever you want into it. I think the one that's most easy to kind of get you, or there's two are sort of easier to get your head around. I remember Death in the Afternoon, which is really looking back about, you know, the fragility of life, the uncertainty of the future. You know, you remember this seemed like a fairly uncertain time when these were put together. And it was apparently provoked by them hearing about John Lennon's death.
Right. Okay.
Which is in December 80. That's what started it. And of course, Death in the Afternoon is a book by Hemingway about nostalgia and, you know, and I think that's one that you can kind of pick up the theme of a little more easily, which is and it's helped by the fact that I think that's one that, whilst it has this lovely electric piano going on in it, it also has an incredible guitar solo that's very powerful in there. And I think the other one that's sort of kind of easier to follow is probably Accent on Youth,
Mhm.
which is really the confusion of teenage life, really, or young
Mhm.
life.
Mhm.
Something new, something sinful.
Mm.
And the fact that you sort of follow it again, it picks up the tempo, having had The Stranger Within, which is quite a relentless
Mm.
beat. It sort of gives you a little gear change, and that might be the reason why they didn't link them all together, because sometimes there are just gear changes that don't meld so easily.
Yeah,
And I think that,
I like the
I
bass
think that
in
does.
Stranger Within as well. The bass
Yeah,
line was cool in that, and the fade. I mean, I look interesting the fade, and then they're into Accent on Youth, and then from there it's kind of
yeah,
um the stitching together towards the end of the album.
yeah. And then, as I say, you've got the two huge singles.
Mm.
Um, The Thin Wall, which is absolutely feelings of paranoia. I mean, Velvet Voices, Smooth and Cold. Um, i- and then it has that backing vocals chanting,
Mm.
which is almost like sort of
Mm.
monks sort of thing,
Yep.
which they also use on Rage in Eden. And it,
Yes.
it makes it feel very, very sinister.
Bit
And then,
Gregorian.
yeah, and then, and the voice, which is sort of about a sort of disillusionment with the media and all of that.
The look and the sound of the voice. They try. The shape and the power of the
And you watch the videos now. If you see the videos of them, they're deliberately
Yeah.
sort of picking up this whole art house theme, and that was something that they kept doing for sort of the next couple of albums.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the things, is that actually, I see Midge interviewed, and you talk to people who worked with him, and they have nothing but good things to say, and how he's one of the most nicest people you could come across. And
He's
yet they are so po-faced as a band.
Yeah. Oh, he seems like a lovely guy. I've watched a
Yeah.
couple of interviews with him. Yeah, he seems like a terrific
But
bloke.
as a band, they don't crack a smile.
No, I
And
didn't watch the videos for those singles you mentioned, but I did watch the Top of the Pop, because they were both performed on Top of the Pops.
right.
The Thin Wall, I think Midge is wearing, totally unironically, what might today be called as one of those sort of baker boy caps.
Right.
But a slightly flatter version.
Yeah.
He's got his little pencil moustache and his well sculpted sideburns.
Which I mimicked. I have to say, I was at school. When I was first able to, I mimicked them. I thought they were great. I had those.
His top is stubbornly tucked into his rather baggy trousers that he's sporting, and
It's high waisters.
the high waisted. There is nary a smile on his otherwise cheery little Scottish face. But no, that's weird, isn't it? That was the sort of band's personality, and yet he has a great deal of warmth about him.
Well, and apparently, and I've seen interviews of Billy Currie,
Yeah,
who is another charming
yeah,
man. I mean, Billy Currie has an incredible CV. Played on a lot of great hits of the time as
yeah,
well. He was in Tubeway Army for a bit with Gary Newman, so Our Friends Electric.
yeah.
He and Midge create Fade to Grey by Visage, which is probably the sort of the pinnacle of the whole
Yeah.
movement when
Yeah.
that becomes a hit.
We fade to grey. We fade to grey.
But
Unbelievable.
like
song.
all the,
Love that song.
but like all these scenes, it's only really 8 months to a year, and it's gone, because then, like the thing that Dave Rimmer said about Ultravox playing on stage, there's a moment when it becomes public,
Yeah,
and nobody's interested anymore. They've
that's
all moved
not
on.
cool.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing these Blitz kids were interested in, it was about being different and cool and different from the rest of the population. So as soon as
Yeah.
started seeing these things that they've been creating at home being sold in the high street shops, that was it. It was dead. Who's the other
So-
band? We haven't mentioned Chris Cross, have we? Other
No.
than in passing, talking about some
Who
of the nice
sadly
bass lines.
passed away earlier this year. which is very sad. And it is, and I think that it's interesting you talk about bass lines because he did play bass synth, but he also played the bass, and a lot of the reason why this sounds slightly deeper is because he's playing bass rather than doing it all on the synth.
Well,
and
that's
I think
it.
it sounds to me, I think of this like an art rock record with synthesizers on it, much more than a sort of synth pop new romantic. It's much closer to a rock record. I mean, you'd probably call it, modern prog rock, which would make me shudder at the thought that I'd been listening to that all these years. But it sort of has that about it.
Can I give you one more lyric before we
go on, please?
Wind up, which again is from that final track. Your name has slipped my mind again. There's one line that goes, "I clench my fist but feel no sensation," and it's just the way he says it. Feel no sensation. And again, I was thinking that little tune he's done there reminds me. It actually reminds me of Kids in America, Kim Wilde.
Wow. Well, that was to come slightly later, same year. Maybe it was.
I clench my fist but feel no sensation. The walls around me spin and sway. Flashback image in my vision. I remember. Oh, your name has slipped my mind.
I have to say I love that track. Somebody described it as being like a freeze frame at the end of a movie.
Yeah.
And I think that's the track for me that it's the one that I think is most important for the whole.
It's my favorite. It's my favorite.
It makes it. Yeah, I think it's mine as well.
My Twilight highlight for sure.
Yeah.
And we've spoken about soundscapes and film soundtracks. This one actually reminds me a bit, and again, I like it. Before I say this, it reminds me a bit of musical theatre. It's a bit like you're hearing a character opening up. It's the end of the first act or something.
Yeah.
Curtain's about to go down, and it's just the character opening up to the audience. Now, I'm no musical theatre expert or
aficionado,
or even an enjoyer thereof. Usually, there are, of course, exceptions. But it did remind me of that. It felt quite intimate, like he's talking to an audience in the theatre. But no, I liked that track a lot.
So we've probably talked enough about all of this. Lots in there. As you know, this again, I've shared with you something that's dear to my heart.
Sure.
But I'm there thinking that perhaps this always was going to be a little bit more on the more testing for you.
I think so.
What do you think?
As I said at the start, I quite enjoyed it. I think it's fair to say I've not enjoyed it as much as the other 3 albums that we've looked at thus far. But I've still, and bear in mind what I said last time, like anything over 50% I've enjoyed. Good. But this is going to get, in university terms, it's going to get a 2-2. So it's 56% this is going to get.
Oh, Bishop Desmond.
A Desmond. So as I say, I quite enjoy it. Anything over 50% has been a worthwhile endeavour. It's not really damning with faint praise. You also know my marking.
You're strict.
The calibration is quite strict. So I mentioned previously, I think some of the things this preceded, if not directly influenced, the likes of Erasure and Pet Shop Boys, which I really like. Maybe I just like the poppier side of this. And that whole thing about it, the whole sort of distance and the fact that I struggled to feel as emotionally engaged in this, which was probably their intention, but made my enjoyment, commensurately slightly lower.
I mean, so I see their influence really less there, more with New Order, more with U2, because I think there's a big sound going on here. Whereas actually, I think always one of the things with what became the synth bands, typically the synth duo, was that it was a much more contained kind of soundscape. Whereas I think this is big and borrows much more from Simple Minds and U2 and the Waterboys and that world. than I think it does to
Yeah,
OMD, for instance.
I think that's a really fair comment. And actually, my first thought, which I mentioned right at the top of this, was my sort of pleasant surprise at hearing genuine, slightly heavy in parts, sort of rock guitar and bass lines.
Yeah.
And those things that I could quite easily attribute those to U2, and I'm sure those other bands you mentioned there, and that felt at first jarring, but jarring in a good way, and made it more interesting for that, I think. So I think that's a very fair comment.
Good.
We also
before
need
we
to
go, tidbit.
The tidbit, yes. So this is about other albums where the band or artist has written no material before entering the studio. So what have you got?
The only one I can come up with in the short space of time that we have clearly was Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones, 1972.
Really?
They were living as tax exiles in the south of France. And they were, I think Keith was living above they were occupying an old villa.
Yeah.
And in the dungeons, they'd set up the kind of recording studio, and the mobile unit was outside.
Yeah.
And they were all staying in different chateaus and villas all over the south of France. And I think Bill, it used to take him like 3 hours to get there. And they'd get there and Keith would still be in bed, and it did. But that was made, and they wrote and played and created it all kind of on the job.
Okay.
But I think there are other people who do it. But I mean, I think most of the time they're likely to be fairly well rehearsed because it's expensive time. So
well, indeed. The couple that I had to look up, I couldn't think of any. But I had the luxury of doing a bit of research before we came on air. One is Invisible Touch by Genesis. But again, this appears to have been the way that Genesis used to work. They used to just go and do it all in the studio. And similarly, in a more recent example, the Black Keys. So the Black Keys album, Let's Rock, I think was one that they'd had a 5-year hiatus. But they went into the studio. And then I was reading about that saying, all right, they went in and as usual, they said, or something, they sort of did it all there and then. So perhaps it's a thing that certain bands or artists do. It just struck me as unusual when I read about it in terms of this one.
I think it's unusual to go and sit on a German farm and do it.
Yeah, it would have its own strange pull. I'm sure if you're...
But its own bovine grace.
That must be it, surely.
And on that, I think we've probably said all that needs to be said.
It's beautiful. Well, I enjoyed it enormously, as ever, Tone. And
well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for joining us at the turntable. What little I've had, I've enjoyed.
As ever, a huge pleasure. We'll see you next time at the Twilight Turntable,
where we'll be trying to change the world one late night long player at a time. Please try listening.